welcome to the Digital Dialogues podcast. We're excited to have Dr. Paul Platosh as our guest today. He's a visionary in the field of geospatial technology, environmental design, and facilities management. Dr. Platosh is currently the Facilities Systems Administrator for the state of Oregon, where he leads initiatives in the real estate management, space planning, and sustainability, bringing innovative GIS technology to shape the built environment. But there's much more to Dr. Platosh's journey. With a PhD in design and human environment and a deep focus on GIS, he has been at the forefront of applying cutting-edge technologies like LiDAR and remote sensing to solve real-world challenges. His academic and professional background includes leadership in design, education, and data-driven decision-making, all of which he brings together in his current role. In today's conversation, we'll explore Dr. Platosh's unique journey from his early experiences that shaped his career to his current role leading to transformative projects in facilities management and more. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Paul Platosh, Facilities System Administrator for the state of Oregon. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, T. That's a wonderful introduction. I appreciate it, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Let's dive right into it. To start things off, maybe you could start by telling us a little bit about your current role at the state of Oregon.
Sure, yeah. As you mentioned, I am now the Facility Systems Admin at Enterprise Asset Management in the state of Oregon, and this is in the Department of Administrative Services. So our agency is the oversight agency to a lot of different processes in the state. I started over at the Chief Financial Office doing similar things, but I would say at some point leadership had a decision to move our group, which was doing similar things from there to enterprise asset management, where we're more directly applicable to the processes at the state. Initially, our group was founded to help guide our biennial budget build. So we were looking at facilities and determining what was an appropriate budget for deferred maintenance needs and facility planning needs across the state. And as you can almost imagine, it of course always grew into other ideas where as you're exploring things, you find initiatives that you might want to start. And Chief Financial Office is not a good place to do that. They're bean counters, and that's their role. EAM had a much larger purview and a larger budget, frankly. So they wisely moved us over, and I've been doing that there ever since. And my role is Facility Systems Admin. I'm an advisor to the Deputy Director of EAM. On technology needs. It's my job to shepherd initiatives, but also to start them, to bring new ideas to the table. Some things specifically around Troy Regan now, it's where I'm really working a lot, spending a lot of my time, but it really is intended to be a kind of a catch-all position. So you mentioned my experience with GIS. I've got a lot of GIS initiatives that are coming up, and they are slowly coming to converging in many interesting ways just because of the way the industry is moving. But that's the idea of my job, is to continuously bring innovation to the department.
Wonderful. No, thank you so much for
Sure.
sharing that. Actually, my next question leads right into that. You talked about some important initiatives that you're undertaking, and I wanted to maybe ask you highlight one or two of the key initiatives and how those initiatives, should they be achieved, are going to have some actual tangible benefits to the department that you're working for.
I think the one that I'm most excited about right now is our redevelopment of our executive office building, which is literally the governor's office and all the senior leadership of the state. It's an interesting building. It's built on Salem's Capitol Mall. It was the original statewide headquarters of the post office building back in I think I want to say it was built in maybe the teens, somewhere like that, in 19 teens. So it's just what you might expect for an old office building in this kind of neo-federal style that was popular back then, the mall of the state. And it's got interesting murals that were painted during the WPA era. So some historical things, and it's got some architectural elements that are on the National Register of Historic Places. And then they, at some point in the 70s, decided to add on to it. They had to preserve a lot of the vernacular of that building. So really the idea was to essentially add on a whole sort of wing to one side of that post office And it had this crazy way of navigating in that space because of that. There are elevators that go to nowhere. There's stairwells that kind of circle around, and you find you're like, you started on the third floor, you went up, but now you're on the second floor, things like that. So the experience of being in that building is very confusing. We decided to update that building, and there's a new build out, and at the same time had to be seismically upgraded because we're in a seismic zone. So when they built that building, they weren't thinking about that. And seismic plus kind of complete rethinking of what that space could be, what a government office building should look like, how it should function in a contemporary setting, supporting the kinds of work processes that we have today, including things like work from home. A lot of technology in that building, a lot of interesting kind of things. Yeah, I'm particularly piloting our workplace reservation system in there. This combination of working with elements out of Tririga, and then also with a product called ArcGIS Indoors. And so it gives you that blue dot experience of being on your cell phone and finding out where you are in a building and being able to really enhance the occupant experience for people working in that space. You can
Yeah.
select conference rooms and get catering and all that kind of thing just from an app. I think that's what I'm particularly interested in and really getting there because we haven't created a solution to the work from home hoteling problem that I think more or less everybody is facing, and specifically states are facing. I think every state has now supported some version of work from home. Some folks are a little bit further ahead than others, but we're looking at this building to be really the pilot for what that paradigm could look like. So when we do the ribbon cutting in December, the idea is to hand out an app, the group that'll be moving into that space. And also for visitors, when they come, they'll be able to download it and yeah, see how that goes. And hopefully it solves some user experience issues that we've had.
That's truly fascinating. That's
Mhm.
like history, engineering, and technology coming together.
Yeah,
Truly
it's cool.
fascinating.
It'll be interesting because, yeah, even when we were redoing the architectural elements, because we were actually expanding the footprint of the building, we made plaster casts of friezes and elements in the building and recreated them and installed those things so that experience of the history is maintained.
That's fantastic. The one thing we hope to do in this podcast is understand the human being behind the technology. So I'd love for our listeners to get to know you a little bit better from a background perspective. Maybe could you take us to where it all began? Where did you grow up? What was childhood like?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I grew up in Connecticut, just outside of Hartford, and I come from a Ukrainian immigrant family. So my parents were both born in Ukraine, and we lived in kind of a community that had a lot of Ukrainians in it from kind of World War II era. That's where I grew up, kind of a mixture of New England with old world experience, and I was a middle child, so a little bit of that. I think that kind of actually influences how I look at problems in the world is through the eyes of a middle child. I think that definitely happens. Yeah, and I went through high school there and then graduated from high school and went to Pittsburgh to Carnegie Mellon.
Great. Wow.
Mhm,
Okay. And next question was around that early childhood experiences or even early adult year experiences that probably shaped the path that you're on.
mhm.
You did mention the middle child, but I'd love to hear more.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, so my grandmother was kind of a powerful influence in my life. She was of course, a World War II refugee, and with a lot of Ukrainians had to flee their ancestral homes.
Right.
And but she always had this great attitude, really instilled a lot of sort of core values that I hold dear. And she always told me I would be a teacher. It's a very Ukrainian thing, I think, is to look at all your children and say, you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be a priest, you're going to be a teacher. You go through that. That's maybe common to a lot of immigrants, but I was the teacher, and I thought I'm going to go through and eventually return be into education at some level. And that's what I did for my early career, but very formative time for me was that. Of course, I also grew up in the 80s. As a child, I would say that my decade of childhood was the 80s. And that was time was a very interesting time to be into technology. We were the kids working with the first kind of personal computers. I remember my TRS-80 and my Commodore 64 and all these machines that I learned how to do some basic programming on. We subscribed to, I forget the name of the magazine, but there was a computer magazine that had interesting articles, but always at the very end, you'd flip to the end and there would be code that you could copy and type into. So it was like the way software was distributed was not on a disk or anything. You actually had to type in the code. So I learned a lot about programming by just transcribing code, and those are usually video games of some sort. But yeah, and I remember being very fascinated when I first heard about this thing, which we didn't call the internet, but bulletin boards, and the idea that computers could speak to each other and what that would mean for us. And obviously, I think we all imagined all kinds of futures based on that. But yeah, we were very much tech kids. And again, I still have friends that I keep in touch with. We're all Ukrainians and we're all involved in technology in some way.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
I don't know if that led to your PhD. My next question is around that. You have a PhD in design in human environment
hmm
focused on GIS. It's a mouthful for me. But tell us, what does that mean, Paul? And what was your research about?
Yeah, so I guess I could take a step back and say I went to Carnegie Mellon and I ended up majoring in something they called digital desktop publishing. But this was really the internet as we think of it now. Mozilla, I think, hit right somewhere in the middle of when I was in college. So just thinking about that program that I studied, the professors there and the leadership of Carnegie Mellon at that time were trying to imagine what publishing would look like given realities of internet. And it was the first time where publishing was transforming into a digital realm. That's what I studied. That transformed into a career shortly after that. I started with that publishing kind of background, but I quickly went to consulting. That was the dot-com era. And that all brought me together to getting to a place where eventually I ended up teaching for a graphic design program. Just enjoyed it. And right around 2013, I said, it's been good. I turned 40 and I thought, what should I do next? Not that I was unhappy or whatever. 40 is a good time to reflect on things.
Yeah.
I said, you know what? Maybe some people buy race cars when they hit 40. I decided I'm going to go get a PhD. So I quit my job. And the good thing about being older is you get to think about what is your past experiences and how you connect it all together. And I had developed an interest in cartography, and that got me to GIS. I hadn't really known much about it other than what we might think of with your commercial grade GIS, like a Google Maps. So I just thought this looks like a very interesting thing to go to. And coincidentally, I thought GIS will have some kind of impact on the creative process because I was in design and I thought these worlds will come together in some way, in some mashup that we're not really sure of yet. So I thought, let me explore this. And I looked around, and in the design department, there was designing human environment. It's essentially what you might think of as interior design, but there's other aspects of the near environment. That's what we call it, as the near environment, which is maybe the built environment, but also the things that are the spaces that humans inhabit within arm's reach. So there was even like design of things. Within that, there was design in the built environment, which focused a lot on human behavior. So how you might mix up design process, the study of human behavior, and then in a PhD, you need to bring things together. So I thought, what if we brought GIS into this thing? And looking at what I could do, what I could study, I found out that GIS had this increasing interest in the indoor GIS. So I thought, oh, this is perfect. Like indoor GIS, which is a developing field, because when we think of GIS, we often think of it as statewide or the distances or where does the elk migrate from in the summer to the winter. And so we're looking at mountain ranges and how fire behaves. And that is true. That's the start. But increasingly the near stuff has come up. It's like smaller spaces and how can GIS help us understand the near environment, right? I studied that, and in the process of working and doing your literature reviews and everything you would do in a PhD, I began to be interested in wayfinding, which is literally for listeners who may not know, it's how people navigate spaces. And there's different ways you could study it. There's a thing called cognitive mapping, which is when you navigate a space, you both perform that activity of moving, but you're also internalizing a map of the space, right? It's a very core human activity. It's very fascinating, actually, to study. But why do we remember spaces? You ask that question. It's a very primal thing. It's because our ancestors 100,000 years ago needed to remember where the watering hole was or
Yeah.
where the best berries could be picked. And so, what is that mental process that takes us from here and remember where something was? And when you start unpacking it, it's this mental shorthand that our minds do and compress space in these interesting ways. And we retrieve them to move through spaces. I thought, can we bring GIS to help us study this? I looked at technologies for wayfinding as my principal research area. Just at the time, the beginnings of wearable devices was around, and I thought there will come a time where there is a wearable device that helps us to navigate spaces, and that's then Google Glasses came up, right? Yeah, so I took Google Glass and I created a project around that where I studied what are the effects of cognitive mapping based on head-mounted displays. And so I had subjects wear that and then navigate an unfamiliar course. And then they would come back into the lab and they would draw it down on paper. And it had a bunch of turns and they had to do it as much detail as they could. And all of those maps would be digitized and then put in GIS tools to understand how accurate those maps were. And so we tested both glass and then just regular handheld GPS tools to see if there was a difference between the effect of cognitive mapping based on those different form factors. And it turns out that yes, in fact, when you have the heads up and you're encountering the stimulus of the world as you navigate spaces, you are more likely to remember what those spaces look like. That was essentially my dissertation was built on. It has a lot of applicability. I got contacted by the military at one point to find out about they were making helmets for helicopter pilots. So that was something that you could see, oh yeah, there's even a military application to this. So yeah.
That is fascinating. It really blew my mind. But yeah, and I can now relate and I can see how you're using that knowledge as a
Hmm.
facility system administrator, working with design and GIS with the state of Oregon. And now, Paul, you're aware we're getting into the world of AI. There's more and more talk of AI. And in fact, I was at the Amazon Summit earlier this year, and the keynote speaker was talking about how we are at the early days of AI. We are almost like where we were with Mozilla and Netscape. When internet just came out, that's where we were with AI. And they were talking about imagine the days of where this would go when we would have a Netflix like AI application. But I was curious to hear how do you think AI is going to influence GIS or even just facility management from your experience?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We're here, it's coming, and it's going to be transformative, I think, for sure. In terms of the occupant experience for people, I believe that the AI will first find its niche in being essentially like a crutch for people to get through processes that normally would take us some time to learn. We would just allow the AI to help us learn those things. For example, even we're working on a facility condition assessment project right now. Right now, you have to design your FCA, you have to go through what you eventually will be able to do is, of course, just say, I want to do an FCA. What do I have to do? And then the AI will help you uncover that and bring you to a place where the FCA that you have to do not only is right for the facilities you're looking at, but also makes sense in the context of the rest of the portfolio that it has to live in. These kinds of places where the technology can help us to both maintain better data but also keep an eye on the whole ecosystem of that data. That's like what I think one of its real powers is. It knows what the landscape of the data is better than a human does. So that's where I think things will go. But also, there's so much data that we collect that we can't do anything with. It just sits because the human mind can't wrap its brain around it or time around it, or we just can't invest the right. Even doing like a statistical analysis of data takes time and experience, and you have to sometimes go get a PhD or a master's degree and try to work in SPSS to crack some sort of insight that you're getting out of numbers. But now that can happen. I think those kinds of barriers are there for certain types of data that we just put at arm's length because they're just too complicated for us to know how to sort out right now. The AI will help us do that. We'll get to a place where it'll help us sort out through volumes of data that we have left untapped so far. Right. That's I think where we'll see. And we have sensors. We're in a place where our buildings we have smart sensors everywhere. They're just more and more of them happening, and the usage patterns that a person might have in a space. Now that we've got the app and we might be recording how people maneuver through spaces and generate heat maps of where people spend time, then you could begin cross referencing that to places where the climate has been what's the temperature in that space, what kind of energy is being used in that space, like all these different things you can bring into that to understand this data that is here, and we're going to let the computer work on it. Right, like we don't have to spend our
Yeah.
time working on it. And I expect the computer will then turn around and say, here are some insights I have found in your data, right? Like just right there.
Absolutely.
I don't even have to think about it then. I'll be like, wow, really? Okay, that's interesting. And thank you for bringing that to me. That's the future that I hope we get to.
I
I
think
can
that
see.
you're absolutely right, Paul. And I think we're heading in that direction. I was recently hearing this interview by Yuval Harari. He's an author who put out books like Sapiens. I think he just released a recent book called Nexus, which talks precisely about what you mentioned, which is AI is able to ingest data and make sense of data that human brains can't fathom. We can't wrap our hands around it. But again, it's coming out with insights now
Mm.
that people are amazed. They're trying to figure out how did it arrive at this decision. But it is the right decision. It is absolutely the best decision, but there's still some auditing that needs to be done on how sometimes those trails are, they can't figure that out. And that's freaking people out a little bit because more and more we're going to depend on AI eventually because they make great decisions, but we really don't know sometimes how they're arriving at that.
Yeah, you're right. Yeah, I was listening to, I think, a podcast actually about there's a professor in Florida State, and I can't remember his name, but he's come up with a new social network. I think it's called Hey Maven, if I'm not mistaken. But it's social networks right now, of course, are built on essentially likes, right? Likes and follows, right?
Yes.
You like something, you follow something. And essentially what happens is a recursive sort of a process where now you just get fed more and more of the things you like or the
Yeah.
things that you want to follow. How do you gain insight when all you're doing is going back chasing the one thing you like, right? All the time. So the idea with the social network is we're going to allow AI draw insights between multiple different conversations that are happening all over the place. We're going to suggest conversations that are relevant to something you might be talking about from people who aren't a part of that conversation, which
That
I
is
think is fascinating, right? Because you might be thinking, I'm talking about a problem in a vehicle, let's say, and somebody might come in and the AI will make some sort of connection between that conversation and, I don't know, maybe what happened in a baseball game. And so it'll bring those people into that conversation and they will have a different set of expertise and different set of insights and who knows what can come of that, right?
That's absolutely true. And yeah, that actually leads to my next question on that. That's a pretty cool, innovative way of using technology to solve real world problems. I'm going to ask you a more macro question.
Mhm.
Given the compute power we have today, the availability of technology, let's say you had unlimited resources, including technology, to solve one global problem. What would that be, and why is it important?
Yeah, geez, it's the wicked problem idea. Yeah, I think if there were one problem, it would probably be coming back to climate change. And maybe not in whatever, without even going into the politics of what climate change is, but just the effects of human beings on the environment in general. I think we are at a place where we really need to think about where we're going with our footprint on the planet. And I think that as a person who works in facility management, I think of one of the problems with that, or one of the facets of that wicked problem, is that we think it's too big for us to have an effect on. And it is, right? Like any one person's behavior has very little impact on what will happen. But of course, it's that cumulative thing that comes together. I work for state. We've got, I don't know, close to 50,000 employees. 50,000 employees can have an effect on a state. One of the GIS analysis I did was what is the effect of work from home in terms of carbon offset? Because we're not driving anymore. So I was able to trace through payroll. I did a payroll run and mapped everybody's likely commutes from where their home is to their office, their state, their official place of business. And I just calculated based on the kind of EPA estimates of cafe standards what that offset would be, and it's substantial. I wish I had it with me right now, but it's a substantial kind of a thing. I put that in an app, and it's available and out there. It's startling how much we actually do when we don't really think about it. The thing that technology can allow you to say that it says, that, hey, if you don't drive today, here's the contribution you can make. And here's the contribution that others can make too. And if you get everybody together and we do this together, then we have a significance to this. Or even not, even if your contribution is so minuscule, but being able to use a reporting device that allows the person to consciously make that decision may influence that kind of factor of others as well. Yeah, I think that's the sort of thing that, again, it goes back to the data conversation. If you could put enough sensors, if you could report back to folks how small changes of their behavior can affect something like climate change, I think you'd actually see people change their behavior and then multiply that by every organization on the planet. Could you potentially shift the needle? Buckminster Fuller had this concept of the trim tab. I don't know if you've ever heard this. Like he had this sort of thing where trim tab is like when a boat has this small little fin, and when these giant cargo ships are in the ocean, this fin can just make a small adjustment and it actually starts to move the whole ship. So that's like Buckminster Fuller philosophy there. But he thought, could this idea of kind of understanding something so small, could that be a trim tab for climate change? I think it could be. Back in the 90s, when I was a systems admin at Thomson Publishing, and we were putting screensavers on everybody's computers, right? We had several hundred computers that everybody worked on. And so at night, the screensaver would turn on. And I downloaded the SETI, the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence screensaver. That group, what it does is it combs through the galaxies looking for potential signs of life out there.
Yeah.
But what it is, it generates massive amounts of data that the universities or the group doesn't have enough time or power or budget to compute. So they wisely put out the screensaver and they said, if we put out the screensaver and everybody takes a tiny little piece, these screensavers can just chug along and produce results out of this. It can compute the data that it's getting. So I just put it on every single computer at Thomson Publishing, which was having a screensaver anyway. And then once a week, I would get this little report of how much data we processed just by the computer sitting and doing nothing anyway. And that goes back to that. It's like that reporting that was smart of them because I was more likely to do that because I got this kind of report and I could see what some small inconsequential decision I made had a big impact. But yeah, I think we're at a place now where if we could report back to regular users this sort of scorecard of their environmental behavior, and specifically in place like I got this light on. What if I turn the light off and I got a little number came back to me in some way, and that sort of became a incentivized process. I think that's one way to solve that issue. Maybe you wouldn't drive. Maybe you'd say, oh, you know what, I'm at a B minus today, I want to get to B, I'm not going to drive today, I'll just walk to that store, whatever. Like you do make some behavioral modifications. I think that could work.
I think that's a brilliant thought, Paul. Truly, I mean, changing things at a micro level and having an impact at a macro level. Yeah, and I think it's a brilliant way to do it. And in fact, I noticed as you were telling me that, I noticed something that Samsung put out lately. If you're an Android user, they have something called Goals, and then you could download that and you watch an ad that they show, or you read an article that they project there, and then it adds up like a contribution towards something. And you could pick a
Hmm.
goal, one of the sustainability goals, like no poverty or no hunger, and then contribute towards that from this effort, and then Samsung would match it. I've been so fascinated by it. Yeah, I would spend some time on it every day.
Yeah.
Even though it was just like a few cents every day that I'm contributing. So I
Yeah.
completely understand what she's trying to say there.
Yeah, and it's like it doesn't seem like much, but it kind of satisfies this very human need for progress. And oh, I
There
made
you
this
go.
little thing. And then again, knowing that all your colleagues and your friends and your family might be doing the same thing. And so suddenly you realize, oh, that small amount, when I just even the people around me were actually getting to something substantial. And I think that just did to me. I think everybody has a part to play. And it's just, can we use the technology to help report back to us what kind of progress we're making? So it's not so anonymous all the time. I think airlines tried to do that at some point, but I'm not sure how far that's gone because maybe they don't want people to influence their plane travel. But you can calculate what your carbon footprint is based on how much you fly. And it's certainly there's you start to look at all the issues of global inequality and why do Westerners fly so much and contribute to the climate change in such a disproportionate way. So it brings up these questions in the mind that hopefully you then can spur action about.
Absolutely. And I've seen that more in Europe, the airlines calling out what the carbon footprint is versus the US. But that leads on to my next question. If you could pass on one piece of wisdom to the next generation of leaders, what would it be?
Oh, I think humility. Honestly, humility. And I don't know if you would consider myself, I guess I have some position of leadership, but I think very strong dose of humility could be very important for tomorrow's leaders, given that these things that we're talking about, which in technology always have a very positivistic view of them. But there's a dark side to all of these things. And we can see that without stepping into quagmires of politics with things like Elon Musk. But you have these folks that have tremendous power, right? They have tremendous power, in some ways motivated by an unbridled sense of progress. And how do you promote that, but at the same time also recognize that unchecked ambition can lead you to bad places? We have to be understanding of that. Things like AI for good people. So you will think, oh, we'll be using them for good. But there is this potential for nefarious activities. What can it be within that? Ultimately, how do you stop that? If you're a humble person, then you are less likely to go down those dark paths.
Yeah,
So that's it. I think ultimately humility leads to empathy, and empathy leads to this notion of I have these tremendous tools that could do tremendous things, but I really have to think about what the long-term impacts of them are. And yeah, I think that's it.
absolutely. No,
Yeah.
I think those are great words of wisdom. I think humility is necessarily the call of the hour today. I've read this book. It's called Servant Leader, and it stuck with me. I think leaders are truly here to serve, and sometimes I think people forget that. But
Yep.
thank you for reminding us of that. Yeah, this has been a fascinating podcast so far, and we're almost at the end of it. Is there anything else, Paul, you'd like to share with our listeners that you feel might add value?
Yeah, I think if there are listeners out there who are working in the space of facility management, but then thinking about GIS, I just wanted to underscore that there's so much work to be done there and so much potential to bring those two worlds together. There's both the need and there's the demand for it, and then there's the development for it. I think if our listeners could really explore what GIS could do in the built environment and near GIS, then you find some very interesting things. See what Esri is doing. Look at how they're partnering with IBM and Tririga, for example, as that partnership has blossomed and it's creating some really interesting mashups. Yeah, I think just keep looking, explore GIS if you haven't.
That's fantastic. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the show today. Your
Thank you, T.
insights into the power of GIS, especially in technology, and how it's transforming our workplaces, built environment, and facilities has been enlightening. I'm sure our listeners have gained a lot from your experience and thoughtful perspectives. Thank you so much again for sharing your journey with us and for the impactful work you continue to do. To
Thank
our
you, T. I
listeners,
appreciate that. Yeah,
thank you.
thank you. Thank you for the invitation. It's been very interesting. It's my first time being a podcast guest, so I appreciate that.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Digital Dialogues. Stay curious, keep innovating, and we'll see you next time.